Welcome to The Good Ride. I'm James Beastie, and I'm just being me in a world that isn't. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to explain to you about camber profiles. It's been a long time since I've done this, so it's time to update this video. Now, there are a lot of ways a board is bent from tip to tail, and all of these ways change the way a board interacts with the snow and gives you a different on-snow feel. So the first and probably the most forgiving, but the most loose and auto-spinny is continuous rocker. I don't have one here with me, so I'm going to give you an example. These are bent from the middle, and then there's just continuous rocker going up. It's very loose, it's very forgiving, it's very playful, it's fun in the park, it's very fun for beginners, but it lacks on a turn. It hurries you up through the turn. It doesn't have pop in the tip and tail, but it does have pop from between the feet. And it can be a very good solution for beginners and intermediates who want to avoid catching an edge. Next up, there's flat to rocker. Again, there aren't a lot of flat to rocker boards out there these days. You often see them on powder boards and beginner boards. There's usually flat between the feet or a little bit past that then goes to rocker. It feels much more stable one footing off the chair and flat basing than continuous rocker. It's pretty forgiving too, not as forgiving as continuous rocker, but a beginner could ride this and have a really easy time. Next up is hybrid rocker, and that has rocker between the feet going to camber, but the camber doesn't touch the snow. This is a very forgiving ride too, and just about anybody can ride this. It does feel loose, AKA it's hard to one foot off a chair. It's hard to go down a long flat cat track because it gets a little auto spinny on you. It wants to spin around. Sometimes you can end up doing a 360 when you get off the chair. But that's mainly when the conditions are firmer. When the conditions are more soft, this feels more stable than continuous rocker boards. Next up is a very common camber profile out there these days called hybrid camber. Now that's camber generally between the feet or a little bit past with a good bit of early rise before the nose and tail. This gives you a lot of stability, one footing and flat basing off a chair, going down a long flat cat track. It tracks really well, but it's massively more forgiving than full camber. A beginner or intermediate could ride this very well. It might not be as forgiving as continuous rocker or some flat to rocker boards, but it's close enough and it's very recommendable for people of all ability levels. Next up is what I call mostly camber, and that means there's a healthy bow of camber going well past the inserts, and then there's usually just a little bit of early rise before the nose and the tail, like you see with this Roam Agent Pro. There's just about an inch of early rise before the nose and tail. That makes it much more forgiving than full camber, but still a lot more technical than more hybrid camber that has a lot more early rise before the nose. It tracks really well, it one foots really well, it has almost that full camber feel, but a little less catch and a lot more pop, which is always appreciated at the advanced to expert level. There is also mostly camber with passive bends in between the feet. For example, with this Never Summer Cougar, which is recurve triple camber, you can see a mellow camber between the bindings, then going to another two cambers here, but both of them are off the snow. This ends right here, and then there's a little bit of early rise, but it still has a mostly camber feel. You'll see other double camber style boards with brands like LibTech, GNU, and others, where they have a passive rocker that's off the snow going to camber, sometimes with a little bit of early rise, sometimes camber to the tip and tail. We generally call those mostly camber. However, if there's a good bit of early rise, I will call that hybrid camber, even though it has all these bends in the middle. Its general ride on snow is very similar to how I described the Roam Agent Pro. Just sometimes boards with these extra bends in the middle pack in a little more pop while still giving you a little bit more of a forgiving nature than full camber. There are also hybrid camber and mostly camber boards that sometimes have flat somewhere near the tip and tail before it goes to rocker. Sometimes it's just flat to the nose and tail. For example, with this Nidecker Megalight, you have a mellow camber between the feet, kind of directional camber, going to flat, and then some early rise in the nose, and then a good bit of flat going through the tail before a little bit of early rise. You can also see that in a true twin that's mostly camber. I don't have an example here, but I'm just going to use my hands. It goes camber to a little bit of flat to a little bit of kick. You can see this on boards like the Capita DOA, the Super DOA, the Outsiders, and of course, one of our personal favorites, the Indoor Survival. There are lots of other brands who do this as well, but it's something I wanted to bring to your attention. Then there's directional camber and directional rocker. Directional camber means there's a little more early rise in the nose and then little to no early rise in the tail. Here's a good example with the Cruel Auto. You can see there's a healthy bow of camber going from almost the tail to a good bit before the nose. So there's a lot more rocker here than there is rocker in the tail. You can see the same thing with directional flat to rocker, where I'm just gonna flatten this board and it would be the same thing. There's more rocker in the nose than there is the tail. Same thing with hybrid rocker, where they'll have a bend in the middle as opposed to camber, and then camber going back to the tail, but that's usually more pronounced, a little shorter. Then they have a longer, more mellow elliptical camber up in the nose that then goes to rocker. These favor those that like powder, that like more directional riding, and want a little more spring out of the tail. Then we have full camber, which is basically camber from the tip to tail. There is no early rise whatsoever. This is super technical, super unforgiving. This is what I learned on. This is how I got injured a lot. And you're lucky that you don't see this in every board these days. This isn't very common anymore, but it's still very well liked with advanced to expert riders, true rippers who want full pop from tip to tail and don't want any compromises. This is very difficult to ride in powder and very unforgiving, but many are willing to make those sacrifices for this kind of pop. Now, lastly, there's one other element to a camber profile that you can see with a lot of other boards. Here's an example with this Amplid Holy Grail. You can see the sides of the nose are lifted up. Now, there can also be lifted sides throughout the effective edge, like you see here with the Arbor Satori, or like you see with Battalion triple base technology boards, and a lot of other boards that have spoon tech, like Jones, where the lifted tech goes from the nose just a little bit into the effective edge. They all have a different feel, but when I mention lifted sides, it means something between the nose and almost all the way to the center is lifted. With boards that have an aggressive lift throughout the effective edge, it means it can be very forgiving, but a little washy, a little edgeless. It can feel somewhat like a continuous rocker board because you're not on the edges. They don't always provide extra float, but they might provide a better turning experience in powder or soft snow. They also come with any kind of camber profile. For example, this Amplid Holy Grail is directional camber with a lifted nose. So on effective edge, it's camber. There's no lift there. But when you get to the nose, it's lifted. But this can also be on flat to rocker. This can be on hybrid camber. This can even be with full camber from tip to tail with lifted sides. There are all kinds of ways you can bend the effective edge up, the nose up, and the tail up. So there's my explanation of camber profiles. It's one of the most important ways to determine how a board's going to interact on snow.